you. But Dr. Wheelan, we're very happy to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, it's good to see you. It's been a while. Yeah. I remember when I first got this job, Michael said, all right, I'm watching you. Because the commission and the HBCU community were kind of at odds, I think, when I got. I start my 13th year as president of the commission the end of this month. So, yeah, I'm hopeful that you have seen a change and a sea change in how we work with our institutions. How you doing? All right, please keep eating. That's going to be much more interesting than my presentation. I just ask you not to make a whole lot of noise with your silverware. Trying to put a presentation together on assessment when you don't know the people in the room is kind of difficult. So I don't want any of you to feel insulted about the elementary nature of this presentation, because as an educator, I know that sometimes if you assume that people know what you're talking about, you kind of just are blowing a lot of smoke. And we already get accused of blowing a lot of smoke, so I don't want to do that today. But I do want to cover some basics about assessment, okay? I was on a panel Monday, I think, Monday in DC with two of the other regional accreditors, and we were talking about assessment and how there's an accusation that accreditors stand in the way of innovation. And that is just not true. You know, we do have rules and regulations that we want to put in place before you become too innovative, because we don't want you to fall on your face and we don't want you to muck up the student's life either. So yes, we have some standards that we ask you to go through, but we really don't stand in the way. We encourage institutions to be innovative, but we need you to also keep in mind that those innovations need to have a purpose. They need to have something to do with the mission that you do and not just something that's out there. One of the comments that one of the presenters made was that oftentimes IE people or IR people have presidents who go off to meetings and hear all these wonderful things that are happening and then come back and say, okay, now make me look as good as they do with the data we have. You know, my heart goes out to all of you if you have a president like that, because that just is not the way life works. And, you know, you have to use the data that you have in order to move forward. There was a study that was done, or a survey rather, by Inside Higher Ed in 2011. Of private college presidents, asking them about their planning and assessment programs at their institutions. And only 49.5% of the presidents felt that assessment was an important issue. Well, now there's a problem right off. You know, if your president does not perceive that assessment and student learning outcomes and the data that comes from that is important, then you're already in trouble, not just with the accreditor, but with everything else that's going on, because everybody's looking for accountability nowadays. Everybody wants to know, what am I getting for my investment? And when you look at the cost of higher education, you look at the choices that students have about where to go for their higher education, it's an extremely competitive market. And if you don't have good news to share, then you're going to be left behind. And I think that is happening with a lot of our institutions. Enrollments are dropping because all the press ever prints is a negative stuff. You don't have anything positive to tell them. There's a lot of positive stuff going on. You just have to know how to pitch it. So I'm hopeful that that you are, all of you obviously are in the other, 48% or 42% of the presidents. Of the chief academic officers, though, 30.4% of them felt that their institutions were effective in what was going on. So there's obviously a disconnect between what the president is thinking and what the people who are actually doing the work in the institution are thinking. So I want you to know, I understand you have an uphill battle. And my prayers are with you, and we will do whatever we can to help move you forward. What in the world is assessment? What are we talking about when we're talking about assessment? We're talking about, first of all, an ongoing process. This is not just something to do every 10 years when it's time to go through accreditation. It is not. It is also a systematic kind of process. There should be reasons and rationales for why you do collect the data that you collect. What is the purpose of it? Sometimes the purpose is to know how many dormitories to build. Sometimes the purpose is to know how many scholarships you need to fund. Sometimes the purpose is to know how many students are going out getting jobs and in what field, so that that can drive your curricular decisions. But there needs to be a purpose to it. It needs to involve the defining and selecting and analyzing and interpretation and using the information that you have. It is a process. It's not just an IR office drops a bunch of numbers on the desk and said, here, do something with it. There needs to be a purpose for what it is that you're doing. Institutional effectiveness and departmental practices should go hand in hand. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you, as a former faculty member, the last person I wanted to talk to was the institutional research person telling me how many of my students were flunking out. I don't want to know that. It's not my problem. Well, yeah, it is your problem. It's your problem, and it's the entire institution's problem, because those students are tuition-paying students, and the reputation of your institution is directly related to the success of the students who come to your institutions. And so it is everybody's problem in the institution. And the toughest nuts you have to crack are those of faculty. There is no doubt about it. And the longer the faculty have been there, the harder that shell is to crack, and I understand that. I tell presidents all the time, then ignore them. You go to your younger faculty, your newer faculty, who are, one, trying to get tenure, and number two, who don't have all of the preconceived notions, and show their success. Then those old crumrudgeons will come around and want to know, well, what about me? I've been here forever. Yeah, but you're not doing nothing. You know, when you start doing something, we'll start calling your name out, for rewards and stuff. It is those little things, though, that can make a difference in the culture of the institution. You should be bragging about the number of students who finish your introductory courses and move on to the next level. We take that for granted a lot of times, but the reality is those are successful stories. If you happen to offer some developmental courses, which most of you do not, but if you were, then that's the kind of story you tell. We move students from an 8th grade reading level up to 15th grade reading level in a year. That's a major accomplishment. It speaks volumes for your faculty, and it gets a good news story. You need to make friends with at least one reporter on your local newspaper who's willing every now and then to write a filler article on the good stuff that you're doing, so that it can counteract the stuff that's not always quite so good. Why do you assess? Well, the first reason you assess is to improve student performance. There's just no doubt about it. But you should also do it to make informed decisions. Your budget should be directly tied to your strategic plan. I have a colleague who was at one of your institutions once, and he said faculty would come and say, well, I need money for such, and he'd say, is it in the strategic plan? Well, no, it's not. Well, then I ain't got no money for you. Okay? If it's important, we measure it and we fund it. And that's a message that you need to put out there. If you want some money, then you need to be productive and be doing something. Otherwise, then you're just kind of taking up space. It is important to improve the quality of all the experiences in the institution, the quality of life for the faculty who are there, for the staff who are there. You have a plan that talks about when you're going to replace computers. You have a plan when you're going to talk about the renovations of the buildings. Do you ever talk about the plan for professional development money? Do you ever talk, that's usually the first thing you cut. Faculty travel and professional development, and yet it's a lot cheaper to keep and retool an existing faculty or staff member than it is to recruit and train a new one. And yet we don't invest all the time in what we have because we don't stop to see who is it that's been here this long? How can we use that person? I know that I worked in the Commonwealth of Virginia for 18 years, and they had the Minnie Stevens Piper Foundation kind of award that they gave every year for outstanding faculty and stuff. And, faculty would get all upset, well, how come she got that? I said, why don't you go ask how come she got that? What did she do? The chances of her getting that award next year are probably slim to none. But if you start emulating what she did, then maybe you can get it as well. Instead, we get all envious and huffy and puffy, and who does she think she is? Really, come on. This is what we want to do. We reward the people who are reaching the goals that we set. Those goals should be set based on the data that we put in place. We should also assess to promote continuous improvement. I told students when I was a faculty member that tests were an opportunity to show off. If you show what you've learned. If you haven't learned a whole lot, it's not a real big opportunity. Accreditation is the same way. This is not a gotcha kind of thing. This is an opportunity for you to show all the great things that are going on at your institution. It's also an opportunity for you to identify those areas that need some improvement. But that's the purpose of accreditation, to give you a chance to review yourself and for us to send you a bunch of free labor. Think about it. The consultative services that you get from the peer reviewers who come to you, they cost you overnight lodging and a couple of meals. Compare that to, and I don't want to step on any consultant's toes in the room, but that's a lot cheaper than having to have a long-time consultant come along. If you listen to the recommendations that come forward and take them seriously, they're not meant to be punitive. They only become punitive when you stop listening. And we tell you more than once that you're in trouble with us. We tell you more than twice you're in trouble with us. And this is true irrespective of the region in which you live, by the way. We have an organization in the country called CRAC. It's a C-RAC. We put a dash because otherwise it'd be crack and nobody really would take us seriously. But it is the Council of Regional Accrediting Commissions. It is I and my 6 counterparts who are regional accreditors. And we are in constant communication with each other because even though we have different processes by which we evaluate the effectiveness of the institutions, we're all looking at the same things. And so we try to spread best practices around as well. As a matter of fact, there are at least 2 opportunities that we've had where we put together one set of standards that we all follow. So if you've got online learning at your institution, the process that your region will use is the same one that other regions use because we developed it so that we could all follow it. We just did one on competency-based education. This is where students don't have to go to class anymore. You develop a curriculum for a degree that is totally competency-based. They don't ever have to go to a class, they just have to demonstrate that they have competencies. This is not caught on as quickly as we would have hoped, largely because faculty are scared to death because they figure like, well, you're not going to need me anymore if I don't have to teach a class. Well, yeah, but who's going to develop the competencies? Who's going to assess whether students have earned those or achieved those competencies or not? Come on, we still need faculty. You'll just have a different job. Well, those of us who are close enough to retirement don't want a different job. I like the old job I've had where I just show up with the same yellow notes I've been using for 20 years. I've been a faculty member. I have had to supervise faculty. I feel very comfortable talking about faculty because that is still how many faculty respond. When we're talking about improving student performance, though, we're not just talking about institutionally. We're talking about individual students. Part of your assessment plan needs to have built into it a feedback system to individual students as well, letting them know this is how you're doing. This is how other students in the institution who have taken the same classes you've taken and earned the same grades you have done, or what courses they're taking next. There are plenty of off-the-shelf assessment programs that will do that for you, or you are certainly welcome to develop one of your own. But you need to, if you want to keep students in your institution, you need to give them some feedback as well. Not just at the end of the semester either, but that early alert system that's out there to help them understand that you're in trouble and you need to come pay attention. Whether we like it or not, especially for the 18 to 21-year-olds that you tend to educate more often than not, we are still playing a parental role when it comes to them. They are free and independent, and they get there, and then they lose their minds. And in order for them to be successful, we still have a responsibility to help them learn how to study and how to manage their time so that they can fit in instruction with their social life. Okay? We also, though, have that data should help drive departments, whether you're using it for curriculum decisions on which courses to have. If you have faculty that are offering the same class as a specialty, and they've been offering it for 30 years or even 5 years, and they haven't had but 20 students enroll in 5 years, do you really need that course? Those are valuable resources that are going there. While you've got a faculty member teaching an introductory course that has 500 students or even 50 students in it, why couldn't you spread the wealth? That would help the faculty load as well as the students have better individualized attention. Those are the kinds of things that your data should be driving. And then you start talking about the institution as a whole, and where is the entire freshman class going, and when is the senior class graduating on time, or are they staying longer, things like that. Yeah, you have to have a plan. So there are various reasons for why you should assess. One is because it is the professional responsibility of educators. That is what we do. We have a responsibility to the general public to let them know how well we're doing. Congress is about to make sure that you live up to that responsibility, whether you want to or not, because they're about to tie it to your graduation rates, to how much federal financial aid you get. That is scary as hell. And it's part of what keeps me employed and what keeps Michael employed, because we go up on the Hill and say, you have lost your mind. Because many students who come to our institutions are there because of the football team or because of the academic curriculum, but they're also there because they can't go anyplace else. That's a reality. We have open door institutions, or we have a less stringent admission policy, and if we don't educate them, in many cases, they're not going to be educated, and this country needs them. They don't have the money to go anyplace else a lot of times either, and the scholarships that UNCF provides, or that your institution provides, or your state provides, helps them get an education. That federal financial aid that's now at $1 trillion out there also helps educate them, and when students take out loans and don't pay them back, that hurts everybody. But to ask an institution, to mandate that an institution give back some of its federal financial aid because the student didn't pay back their loan is the most ridiculous thing I have heard in a while. I'm not sure they'll hear me, and no matter how loudly I speak, but I have said that to Virginia Fox, who's chair of the House Education Committee, and to Lamar Alexander's staff, who's chair of Senate Education. If the federal government loans the money, and the institutions don't have anything to say about it, if the business community puts in the jobs and determines the entry salary, and institutions have nothing to say about it, how can you hold an institution responsible when a student doesn't pay the money back? I'm sorry, I'm just a simple girl from San Antonio, but that logic just passes by me. I don't get it at all. And I do have 3 academic degrees from 3 accredited institutions. So, but that's the thinking in Washington. They want to see what their money's buying, and if their money is not being invested well, they want some of it back. So it is important that you assess and that you do put a good foot out there. We have to go through a recognition process in order to be recognized by the Department of Ed so that you can then avail yourself of federal financial aid. That started in the 1950s when the feds were funding the GI Bill, and they wanted to make sure that the money they were giving for GI's education were going to quality institutions. So we partnered with them, and every 5 years I have to go through a recognition process that's very similar to your reaffirmation process. And we just had ours this past week. And while there is nothing in the Higher Ed Act currently that allows me to set minimum graduation rates, I got quizzed for about an hour as to why we don't do that on our own. And trying to explain to people, because all institutions are not alike, and because all students are not alike, and because students don't graduate oftentimes for things over which the institution has no control. They don't want to hear that. They really don't care about that. They figure that you're supposed to make them and rope them and force them to sit there and finish in 4 years. It's an uphill battle, but we're going to get through it. There are indeed accountability requirements. Many states are beginning to set graduation rates. They're putting your funding, in place to match the graduation rates. That's truer for public institutions than it is for private institutions. But don't hold your breath, because it's coming your way too. Foundations and donors want to know how successful you're being. They don't want to invest money in an institution that's not doing anything. The accreditation standards, obviously, which are your standards, by the way. Our members decide those standards. So everybody with whom you work is saying that these are the things that are important. All we're doing is holding you accountable to them. And then for institutional and continuous improvement, it's important that you do assessment. The allocation of time and effort and financial resources that's put into this will pay off in the long run. What is it that we assess? Well, institutionally and programmatically, there are 2 different types of assessment should be done. For institutional assessment, you're looking at campus characteristics, okay? What is your curriculum? I mean, overall, what is your mission of your institution? Are you an agricultural mechanical institution? Are you a STEM institution? Are you a liberal arts institution? What is your purpose? That's the first thing. And then use the data to say, am I living up to that purpose? Looking at campus-wide issues, refurbishing buildings, adding dormitories, adding science labs, renovating the ones that you have, bringing in new technology. All of that should be put into your assessment plan. Why do you need this kind of stuff? Again, campus-wide and department units need to be involved in this conversation. This is not something that should be done in the quiet of the president's office or in the IE director's office. There needs to be people who are impacted by this involved in the conversation. Whether you agree with them or not, they still need to be involved in the conversation. And then lastly, your mission and goals really should drive all of what it is that you're doing. Programmatically, you need to look at the data and disseminate information to the faculty, as I indicated. What does your general education curriculum look like? Can your students read, write, count, think, and speak correctly and use technology? If they can't do that, they're not going to major in diddly. Right? I mean, aren't those the basic courses? I mean, those are the basic skills. I talk with businesses all the time, and they say, well, we just want people who know how to do the job. We'll take care of the rest of it. No, you won't. What you want is somebody, because we don't have the levels of supervision anymore that we used to, you want people who can do the job without supervision, who know when to come in out of the rain, who know when to turn the machine off and turn it on, who can explain to the customers what it is they're doing, who can follow a chain from production to sales, without anybody directing them. That means liberal arts education skills. But it may also mean that those liberal arts faculty have to step out of those silos and talk with the people in the occupational and technical areas so that their skill sets are embedded into those occupational technical courses. Because the reality is, students want a job. That's not why we went to college. That was not our primary goal. Our primary goal was self-betterment and to, make a contribution to society. That ain't nowhere on students' roll today. I have a 32-year-old son. He got his associate's degree, and then he quit because he said, I can go out and make more money without a college degree selling real estate than I can with a college degree. Well, the jury's still out on that one, but he is working that way. But that's the thought. They want money. They want a job. And so part of what we have to do is to convince them that you don't want a job, you want a career. Even if you have 5 or 6 different positions within that career, and what we're trying to prepare you for is that career, not just that first job. That's probably tougher than any lesson that you try to teach them at your institution because they are so focused on making money. I wish you the best, I really do. But the general ed, is still extremely important. Also, monitoring that progress of those students is important. That's why I said you need to let students know how well they're doing because they don't understand that their own productivity is directly related to the reputation of the institution. I remember when, my son's name is Reggie, when he was in high school, he was taking Algebra 2, and he came home one day, he says, why do I have to learn all these formulas? I'm never going to use these formulas again. And I said, you're probably right. But what you will use is the logic that's involved in solving for an unknown. Well, why didn't they just tell me that? Because we've been in this business so long, we just figure you knew that. Students don't know diddly. Even adult students don't always know diddly, either because they didn't learn it when they were in high school years ago, or because it's been so long since they were in high school, they don't recall it. So it really is okay to talk the basics about why we're doing this, why it's important that you give this speech. Why do we still have a speech requirement? Because people have to get up in front of a group of folks like this who they have no idea with whom they're speaking and be able to speak intelligently and grammatically correctly. Because since we don't have diagramming sentences anymore and nobody has to, learn prepositions and stuff, we have to help them understand how to present themselves. We have to help them understand that when you're writing a paper, you're not writing it for yourself, you're writing it so other people can understand your thoughts. We're trying to help them understand that you need to be able to compute without using a calculator, because the battery could die on your phone. We have to help them understand the need to be able to analyze things with very little information. To understand how do you get from point A to point B when you've got these gaps in the information that helps you make that decision. That is still our goal. Where should assessment take place? Well, traditional assessment takes place in the classroom. There's no doubt about it. Faculty will tell you all the time, I already assess my students because I give them tests. No, you don't. You measure how much they've memorized for the day's activity. When you're looking at real learning, that's that end-of-course assessment or that end-of-program assessment to see if they can put together all those facts that you have learned. But in general education, we assess looking at course descriptions. Course descriptions students should be able to know what they're going to learn as soon as they walk into that. You should look at the content of the courses to make sure that it's meeting the needs of the business community, for example, or it's meeting the needs of the general public. Look at the pedagogy. How is it taught? If all you're doing is lecturing to students, you will have lost them the first class period. There is no doubt about it. The role of faculty has changed from the sage on the stage to one of an influencer in the class and one who's directing the conversation. There's nothing wrong with requiring students to do the reading before they get to class and then talk about what they learned or implement what they've already read, not to have to stand up and espouse the theory at the same time. That's different for faculty nowadays. The assignments, you need to assess what are those assignments. If we have, only a midterm and a final, that is so unfair to students. It is unbelievably fair to students. Faculty members who do that are lazy. I'll tell a faculty member that in a heartbeat. They are the laziest because they don't want to do tests. Y'all don't pay me enough to, yeah, well, you knew that when you came and worked here. Yeah, if you came here for the money, you're really in bad shape. At any institution, I don't care how well you pay. That's not why you go into education. You go in to make a difference in the lives of other people. And so the assignments that you give should be pieced, little pieces, little chunks, because we know from the research those very faculty members do that students learn better with and retain it longer with little pieces of information than they do if you try to throw it all to them at one time. It's amazing how we do the research and never pay attention to it. Look at the assignment methods that are given and consider, if your students are athletes, if they are working, if, all those kinds of things. Not to let students off the hook, but by all means to accommodate their learning because students today really are different. More importantly, we should be assessing how much they're improving. What is that first test that you gave, what does the score on that first test you gave look like compared to what it does at the end of the semester? Have you seen any improvement in the writing of the students, in the way they're able to express themselves? When you look at effective assessment strategies, there are all kinds of words that come to mind. I'm not going to read this list, but all of these should be considered when you're putting your assessment plan together. And I will leave this presentation, and you all are welcome to post it on your website or share it with your members so that you all don't have to. I know over lunch it was terrible to bring a PowerPoint. That's why I did it, so you wouldn't take notes. So. And you would listen, because you learn more from listening than you do from writing. And my computer has just frozen. Where's Charlie? Charlie, what happened to my computer that it froze? Yeah, there it goes. I just called your name, Charlie, and it just happened, so thank you. The types of assessment tools, we purposefully do not support or push or sponsor any particular assessment strategy, because different strategies work at different institutions and they work for different processes or different purposes. But some of the ones that are out there include interviews and focus groups, capstone seminars, internships, oral presentations, all of the above, as long as you have a purpose for them and you know what you're going to do with the assessment results that you get from them. You know, portfolios are probably the newest thing out there nowadays. This takes more work than just the multiple choice assessments that most institutions go for, but they're richer in the information than they give you as well. And many of you have graduate students or you have seniors who are looking for projects. Let them work with your assessment information and come up with a pre-dissertation paper that summarizes the results that you have. That's free labor. They used you for it when you were in school. You remember that? Yeah, it still works. It's all right. It's still acceptable. When you get those results, then, what do you do with them? Well, you look at your plan, see if your plan is following it. You should monitor the progress, because ideally you set goals at the beginning and you want to make sure that those goals are being met. You want to look at the strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes in your assessment data, it's just like when you did that thesis or dissertation. You went in with a preconceived idea about what was going to work, and then your data said, no way. So you need to look at it and say, wow, what was I thinking? What was I listening to? That told me we were going to do this, when in reality the data took me in a different direction. It should guide the improvement that's going on. It should be used for accreditation requirements. It should be used in making decisions. Most importantly, in my opinion, it should be used to inform the public on how well you really are doing. Now, for those of you who are not in this region, I apologize for this section of the presentation, but I know that the majority of you are, and those of you in another region probably have a standard somewhere in your accreditation principles that also direct this. But Core Requirement 2.5 is the one that we have that mandates that you have an ongoing, integrated, and institution-wide research-based planning and evaluation process. You see each of those pieces? They're there for a reason. They're not just there to fill up the paper, but we want to see that it really is an organized, systematic planning process that you have in place. This is a core requirement. This is one of those gotta-haves. If you were around in the southern region 15 years ago, you remember the criteria, those must and should statements, of which there were over 400. Yeah, well, this is closely approximated to those must statements. We call them core requirements. There were only 12 of them, but this was one. Your institution has to go through this process. You have to be able to defend who you are and whether you're meeting the mission of the institution. It puts a review of your mission and goals and outcomes. It's supposed to result in continuous improvement, and it demonstrates the institution is effectively accomplishing its mission. We have some partnering standards that go along with it. 331 is the one that gets institutions in trouble with us more often than not. Still, it's gotten better. But we've been doing this since 1989. You would think by now this would be a piece of cake, but it's not. Institutions still have difficulty taking those educational programs and identifying the expected learning outcomes. What in the world, if you have a nursing program, do you expect students to be able to do when they leave you with a degree in nursing? There's supposed to be some specific things, not just pass the nursing exam, but they need to know how to give shots without the person fainting, or putting it in the wrong vein, or, I don't speak nursing, but so I'm pulling this out of my left ear, but, there's specific things that you identify. How do you know if they're doing them or not? Because you assess the skill sets that they have, okay? You also look at the administrative support and the research and the community or public service goals that you have in your institution, if that's appropriate. What are the goals? Why do you do community service? Why do you do research? Why do you have an automotive technology program in a liberal arts institution? You have to have a purpose for all these things. Then you have to use those assessment results to make improvements in your institution. And most of the institutions that get in trouble with us with 331 are there because they fail to tell us what the plan for improvement is. They've done a great job of identifying the outcomes, they've done a great job of identifying the assessment strategies, but they haven't told us what are you going to do with the results, the so what question. Okay, so pay attention to that one, please. We want to make sure that there are college-level general ed competencies, irrespective of the major that your students have. What are those general ed things that you expect them to know how to do? You expect them to know how to write a paragraph, an intelligent paragraph with subject-verb agreement throughout. That sounds real simple, but boy, I've seen some of the reports that come in from your institution, so I wonder about your students when the staff themselves are not doing a good job writing. I'm just saying. Comprehensive Standard 351 is the one that talks about those general ed competencies, and then there is also a federal requirement that talks about assessment. So it's not just us that's putting that on you, but the federal government wants to know about that student achievement. And they measure it in terms of how many students are graduating, how many are getting jobs. I'm not convinced that that's the best way to assess student achievement on the federal level. And we've also spent a lot of time, when I say we, I'm talking about my regional colleagues and I, trying to convince them that students who go to institutions of higher education and don't graduate, that doesn't mean that they have not achieved something at that institution. It does not mean that their experience was totally irrelevant. Students drop out for a variety of reasons. Many of them come back. You all are being painted with a brush right now that says your graduation rates are abysmal. Largely because they're only using IPED's data, which is only looking at first-time, full-time students. Many of your students start as part-time. Many of them don't start, they'll start and stop and start and stop, and so it makes you look terrible. One of the reasons that all of the accreditors undertook a graduation study was so that we could paint a better picture. When I look at the 6-year graduation rate for the HBCU community, it's only about 52%. But that's the national average of all institutions, so it's not that bad. But when I look at the 7- and 8-year graduation rate, it's not much better. And it should be. If students are staying longer, then they should be graduating at higher numbers. We did it with community colleges, looking at their data, and when we looked at 3-year, because IPEDS looks at 150% of the time it takes to complete the degree, so for 4-year degrees it would be 6 years, for 2-year degrees it would be 3 years. Only 20% of students graduate from community colleges, but when you look at the 6-year graduating rate, because so many of their students go part-time, it jumps to 40%. When you include transfers, it increases, the success of your students. When you are looking at students who are still enrolled, IPEDS data doesn't do that. So we've been arguing that there is a need for a different accountability system than IPEDS, and we're thinking that they're listening to us. We'll find out. What are some of the emerging issues in assessment? Well, distance ed is still a big one. You all aren't engaged in that quite as much as the general higher ed population, but there's still some concern about the quality of the distance ed programs and whether they are of equal rigor as those on campus. Whether you have branch campuses or not, this is another issue of if you have off-site programs someplace, are you sure that they're as rigorous as the main campus, and do you have strategies for going in to look at the quality of the faculty, the content of the courses, the assessment of the students? Any consortial arrangements that you have, who's monitoring, who's in charge of that consortial arrangement? We have policies that say if you put it in and you sign it, especially if it's an entity that's not an institution of higher education, we're still holding you responsible because we accredit you, we don't accredit those other folks. So be sure you know about those. Non-credit courses, this is a big one that's coming in now, the micro-credentials. Organizations like Straighterline and edX that are putting in badges and single courses that want to partner with institutions of higher ed. They also want federal financial aid to flow directly to them, not to come to the institution. So the last administration did put in an experimental program to allow that to happen, but they had to create another layer of quality assurance entities to assess the quality of those single courses but they still have to partner with you, and we still have to approve them. So it didn't make their life any easier, just added another layer. Another issue is transparency, and I've talked about accountability, but transparency. How do we know what you're really doing? And when you look at the media today and all the thoughts of fake news, I'm not sure we'll ever be able to convince them that what we tell them is really the truth. We could probably make up anything. They wouldn't believe it anyway, whether it's good or bad. So, what is the role of leadership in the assessment? I know we have some presidents here. You have to determine what the institution needs to know and why. Generally, you'll put a committee together to look at how things are going. You'll put some resources with it. And then, more importantly, you have to champion the effect of the results. If it's bad, you got to be ballsy enough to get up and say, this sucks, folks. We got to do better than this. And call folks out, not publicly, but call them out and say, I'm coming to get you because look at this data. And hold people accountable to what's going on. You need to know how your results are being used. You need to educate the governing board. A lot of times governing boards are complaining, well, we're not doing this and we're not doing that. Well, you haven't shared the data with them because sometimes it's so bad you don't want them to know. But you need to tell them so that they can help you make it better. When I go around speaking to boards, I will tell them the fiduciary responsibility is theirs. And if you need money, it is their job to help you get it. But you have to tell them why you need the money. And you do that because you've got assessment data to show where the holes are. Okay? So what? Why do we do all this? Well, we do it for the betterment of the students who come to us so that their lives will be in a better place than they were when they first came to you. Okay? How about some questions? Thank you. We have a young man here with a microphone, so anybody who has a question? Ah, Charlie's got one in the back. Oh. I think he's got it on. I will tell you a story that I tell every time I ask, are there any questions, and nobody says anything. I taught child psychology, and we were talking about the advantages of breastfeeding children versus bottle feeding children in a class that I had, and how the antibodies pass from the mother to the baby, and how you learn to bond with your baby because we haven't found a way to detach a breast yet. And I had a student ask me if black women had chocolate milk in their breast. It's a true story. I got a reaction much like this. Some people just groaned out loud. Others sat there in shock, like, did she really ask that question? But there were others who were sitting there, and you could see they were trying to process the possibility of chocolate milk. So after the laughter died down, I said, that's probably the most interesting question that I've ever heard, but no, to the best of my knowledge, there are no flavoring packets in black women's breasts. But you should also thank this young lady for asking the question because she just prevented you from getting an ulcer. Because we can't laugh and produce an ulcer at the same time. So the lesson there is no matter how stupid you think your question might sound, please feel comfortable asking it. The worst that'll happen is you'll keep the rest of us from getting an ulcer for the day. Who's brave enough? Ah, Dr. Lomax, I knew I could depend on you.
Well, first of all, I do want to thank you for being here. And I also want to say that this 13-year journey that both of us has been on has been, well, certainly, we didn't think we'd get to Oz, but we will, we may be there.
We've taken a major detour.
Yeah, we've taken a big detour. So, I think one of the questions about this, you asked what's the role of the leadership. I'd also ask what's the role of the board? And how is SACS looking at board performance related to these fiduciary issues as well?
First of all, about 7 years ago, we became a separately incorporated organization from our parent company. Since 1895, up until 7 years ago, you were accredited by the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, or SACS. 7 years ago, our board got the authority to make its own decisions. So we are no longer SACS. I'd appreciate if you'd stop calling us that. We are SACS COC. No, we are SACS COC, and I say that for everybody. We are trying to brand that name because we are a separate 501c3, and it does legitimize the actions of our own board. It used to be that our board made a decision, it had to go to the SACS board, and they had to ratify ratify it, and that's not true anymore. And I meant to say that when I first started. You just reminded me. Secondly, I have spent the better part of 5 years going around 2 boards. As a matter of fact, before the summer's over, I'm going to Stillman, and I'm going to FAMU next week. I'm going to UNC tomorrow. You know, I'm going to lots of boards to help them understand. There are 3 things that we ask of board members. One is to make policy. Not carry out policy, not try to administer policy. When they start doing things like that, they get in trouble with us, and we have to come back and remind them that's not your job. That's why you do the second thing that we ask you to do, and that's hire, evaluate, and if necessary, fire the CEO. Okay? And then the third thing is to have fiduciary responsibility. That's all we ask you to do. That's a lot. And you need information to do that. But because the president is your employee, that is the only person the board hires, all of that information should come from the president. Because when they start going around to other offices and stuff trying to get information, they're getting a very narrow piece of information. They are expecting their president to have a hands on everything that's going on. Additionally, we ask boards to realize they have no power and authority as individuals. The power comes from the board collectively. And so when you start getting a group of board members together to create havoc, then that gets them in trouble with us. The University of Virginia was put on a warning with us because 3 of their board members tried to undermine the process to get rid of the president. We just don't allow that. That's not the way you play nicely in the sandbox. A lot of our board, the commission board, has started citing boards when our institutions are in financial trouble because we feel that they're not paying attention. They're not asking the right questions. They're not contributing to the financial security of the institution. And that is their job. I mean, the bottom line is with them for having enough money to keep that institution running. They're not asking the questions, why are we spending so much here? One of the examples that AGB does, which is an organization I would suggest you all ask your boards to think about getting some of their literature anyway, the Association of Governing Boards, is it says if you're spending more money on the staff to raise money than the staff is earning, something's wrong. And you need to ask that question. Okay, that is not a good return on investment when you're spending more to raise the money than that group is bringing in. You need to rethink that one. Or why are we spending more money on business programs and not science programs when our mission is a science-related institution? Those are the kinds of things that I always suggest to the boards that they need to be asking. That's the kind of thing that presidents should just be telling them in order to get their support for improving the budget and getting better things out there. Our board members, a lot of times, whether they're elected or appointed, are trying to make a name for themselves. Okay, and they think the more press they can get, then the better their chances of getting elected to a higher position. And I tell them, I wish you well in that, but while you're here, could you attend to the institution instead? And they're starting to listen. I mean, there's still some of them that are hanging out there. You know some of them. But for the most part, they understand that. We also have boards that have more alumni on it than is productive. There's a good word, right? Productive. Because they want things to stay the way they were when they were at the institution. They don't understand things are changing. And you have to have people who are willing to see that change through. We have a lot of brand new presidents coming in who need to be nurtured. And when you have board members who've been there a while and who haven't had to nurture a president, they don't know how to nurture a new president, so you got a new president who ends up falling on his or her face because they don't have anybody helping them get through the process. So we did our small college initiative this past April on governance and invited the president and the board chair from our small and private institutions. And that's one of the reasons, I'm going to so many institutions now because they came and thought, well, maybe our whole board needs to hear this. So I got my suitcase packed all the time. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Wheelan, for your comments again. One question I have is about, you know HBCUs well, given your role at SACS COC.
Thank you.
And the question I have is, as low-resource institutions, you talked about assessment and the importance of data and we know the importance of data analytics. We've seen, schools like Georgia State are getting a lot of attention because of how they leverage data to transform their institution. What recommendations do you have for institutions who don't have the same kind of resources as a Georgia State or other institutions that are leveraging data in a more comprehensive manner?
Stop trying to do it by yourself.
Okay.
Why can't you form a consortium of assessment people? You'll have more data, but you'll have people who are looking collectively at data. Many of my institutions, not just HBCUs, and I think it's probably endemic more to small and private institutions, feel like I got to do it myself or it doesn't have value. There is nothing out there, and there's certainly nothing that we have in place that prohibits you from getting 3 or 4 of you together and having one office of institutional effectiveness for 3 or 4 institutions collectively. There's nothing to stop that at all. And if anything, one of the things we just did was to send out a letter out to all of our presidents asking, is this IPEDS data that we put out there correct? Is the National Student Clearinghouse data that also includes transfers and part-time students correct? Or is the data you send us correct? And identify for me 10 or 15 peers in this region with whom you are competing. Why not get those peers together for a consortium and look at the data collectively among those peers? But we just get very, proprietary with our data, and we don't want everybody else to know. It's the most ridiculous thing in the universe, as far as I'm concerned. But that's what I would suggest. You all are not that far apart because you're all in the South, right? Even Maryland, and we'll consider you part of the South, even though you're north of the Mason-Dixon line, or Nebraska or Pennsylvania, whatever. We're collectively all close enough, and especially with technology, all you had to do is send an electronic file and let somebody handle it for you. But you have to have some trust in that other institution. You have to have some open communication going there. But that's one thing that's saving some of the other institutions. When you look at the Kentucky Community Technical College system, for example, they have a centralized office for research that does all 18, 25, 30, however many institutions they have. Why not? We'll save you some money that you could put someplace else. So the two people running this conference are the only 2 that have questions. Shame on you.
Dr. Wheelan,
Yes, Daphne.
you made a comment earlier, and you said that the standards are created by us, right? And I was wondering about the participation that you're seeing within SAC-COC from HBCUs.
Mike will remember the first meeting I attended with the HBCU presidents in September of '05, where I told them that just because I look like you doesn't mean you can expect any special privileges. It was very upfront, and I said, but what I will promise is that I will help you understand the process and get through the process, but you have to help me by serving on peer review committees and getting on the board. And I am pleased to say we've had a much higher level of participation at both as on-site readers, off-site readers, and board members than we had when I first came on board 12 years ago. I think Haywood was probably one who was actively involved. Well, no, I guess Xavier's former president was, but there were 3 or 4 of you only. Shirley was on there from Payne when I was hired, but beyond that, we didn't see folks. I still don't have enough presidents involved, but at least your staff members are being involved. And by the same token, I've had to educate my staff. As a matter of fact, I had a couple of staff members retire when I first came because I said, I don't want no all-white, no all-black committee members. Teams. We're integrating these teams because our student populations are integrated. But I need somebody who understands the mission. And they were putting people to come out on your teams who didn't speak HBCU mission. And I said, this ain't gonna fly. Come on, folk. So we've done a better job, I think, internally and externally, but it's never enough. We are adding 2 standards this year, since you mentioned standards about our board that we're hoping the membership will approve. One is that since we ask you to evaluate, no, we don't ask you, we tell you that you have to evaluate everybody in the institution except the board, we're now saying that the board needs to evaluate itself. So tell your presidents to show up and vote in favor of that in December if they want that to happen, because it just makes no sense. We're not telling them how to evaluate themselves, but we want evidence that they have taken time to look and see what their role is and are they doing it. The second one is, because the feds really do want students to pay back their loans, but because I still don't feel like that's your problem, actually it's your problem but not your fault, we're asking that every institution put in a financial literacy unit somewhere in their institutions to help students understand what it's like to borrow money. Many of your students have never had money, to do anything with, let alone go to college. And so taking a loan for a tuition is not something they understand has to be paid back, and what happens if you don't pay it back. The same thing, though, is if they take a loan to buy a house or to buy a car, they don't understand that those things can be taken away from you if you don't, pay them back. So we're asking, those are the two new standards that in our region we're putting in, or wanting to put in this fall.
And then part two, sorry about that.
That's
but, I feel as if it's the perfect storm with regards to a lot of our institutions are heavily dependent on loans from the Department of Education. And we're seeing a few of those loans go belly up.
Yep.
And we are seeing tightened restrictions and, in certain standards, and we're not meeting metrics in graduation rates, this financial aid metric that they're coming in with now. So it seems as if finances continue to be the bane of our existence.
Yes.
So how do we ensure that our institutions, of course, outside of fundraising, we know we've got to manage cash-strapped institutions, but how do we ensure that our accreditation is not placed in harm's way solely because we continue to serve students who can't afford a college education?
Well, certainly one of the arguments that I have every time I go to Washington is you have to consider the student body and who's there and the skill sets, and that it is going to take some students longer than it is others. And if you close those institutions, then you really won't have enough U.S. citizens to go and fill the jobs for which we need people to fill. And they understand that. They just have to do something. I think that institutions need to take a hard look at who they are and what they're offering and stop trying to be everything to everybody. If you go, just because you've offered a program for years does not necessarily mean you should continue to offer that program. That's why you have program reviews. And you should have that program review or have the data in enough time that you could actually send a faculty member back to take a class or two in another discipline that they could then come back and be put into that discipline rather than the one about which you're about to close. Do you understand what I'm saying? Remember I told you it's a lot easier to keep a faculty member or a staff member and retrain them to put them someplace else than it is to recruit a new one. And so getting rid of programs is a tough thing to do. But if you have the data to show that over the last 10 years, you have had 12 students graduate from this program, I'm sorry, I was not an economics major or a business major, but that sounds like a pretty poor return on the investment to me. So making those hard decisions is something that's got to have. Putting in new degree programs may be the answer, but it's not if you're just adding them on top of the ones that you already have. That's one reason that we have to approve it. We ask you, what's that going to do to your finances? What does that do with your faculty? Because if it's just making it worse, adding athletics is not going to be the answer, because that is much more cost prohibitive than it is cost effective, because most of those students come to you on scholarships anyway, so you're not benefiting any money from it. I think it is time for HBCUs to look at online learning. It is time for HBCUs to look at adult students. My generation did not have as many children as my mother's generation or her mother's generation. We literally don't have enough 18 to 21-year-olds to populate all the college classes. And so that's another reason your enrollments are declining. Not so much that students don't want to come to HBCUs, but because there aren't as many of them. Add to that the fact that they can go anywhere now, that have newer facilities, that have more amenities. Because this is the I generation. that you're trying to educate, what's in it for me kind of thing, Do I have my iPhone plug everywhere I go? Do I have a iTV or, whatever it is? I mean, they want all the bells and whistles. And some of you are not in a position to provide those bells and whistles, so you got to have something else that's going to attract them. It is time for you to look at those adult students and to get faculty to understand that classes from 8 to 12 may work, but those from 2 to 7, will get us a better return. You get to sleep late in the morning for a change. So I mean, all of those, but if you don't have the data to show what this is doing, then you're going to be blowing smoke. Yeah. Now we're getting questions. Here we go. Did I step on toes or what? Okay.
Actually, I think I was next, but Dr. Wheelan, thank you for your presentation. My question is, I'm from the Midwest, and the Higher Learning Commission was an accrediting body in the Midwest. I now work at Virginia Union University in Virginia.
I'll be there Thursday, next Thursday.
Excellent. And can you talk about the difference in philosophy between like the Higher Learning Commission and SACS CLC? Because it seems like SACS has a very different accreditation philosophy compared to the Higher Learning Commission in the Midwest, or at least that's the impression that I've gotten since I've been at Virginia Union, unless I'm somehow mistaken.
I have not heard that our philosophies are different. I have heard that our processes, our processes and approach are different.
Right.
Yeah, when we started out, we were much more prescriptive than the other regional accreditors are. We used to literally count library books per discipline, because we wanted to make sure that students had enough original source material when they were doing their research. So we've always been much more bean counters than any of the others. They've been more philosophical in whatever it is that they're doing. And sometimes getting down in the weeds creates challenges that, not knowing what those weeds are, don't. That's the best analogy that I can use. But we're all looking at the governance structure, the administrative structure, the outcomes that the students have and stuff like that. We're just more directive and specific with what we do. We're not nearly as prescriptive as we used to be. Faculty credentials is a good example of that. We used to mandate that you have a master's degree and 18 graduate hours in whatever you're teaching. And we don't have that requirement anymore. We have not had that requirement since 2002, by the way. Anybody, don't look at me if you are surprised at that, because I don't want to know that 15 years later people still don't know we don't have that requirement. Every time an institution gets ready to go through reaffirmation, I have adjunct faculty who call and say, they're telling me I can't stay on staff anymore because I don't have a master's and 18 graduate. I said, you go back and tell them they haven't read the principles. So that's I think, the bigger difference than anything else. We're a much more hands-on prescriptive process. Translated means we're more rigorous by some people's translation, but I don't know. This lady here had a question. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'd like to have you speak just a little bit more about the administrative unit's responsibility in demonstrating effectiveness.
Well, first of all, every administrative unit should have a purpose and goals as well. If your goal is to ensure 3 new degree programs are implemented over the next 5 years, and we need to see that that's indeed what your goal is. Or your goal is to reduce the number of retirements, pick what, you have to have goals. And so we come in and ask that as well. But we also ask you to monitor the goals that your individual disciplines have. Okay, where they need to say things like in the occupational technical areas like nursing and engineering and law and stuff, it's a lot easier to do because you do have the licensure exam, or teacher at the licensure exam, and you can say, we're going to increase these numbers by 20%. But you can also have an increase in the number of completions. We will have 30% of our students will become majors over the next 2 years from our introductory class, or 15% will, I'm a psychology major, so we'll move into and take abnormal psych, because those kinds of goals will help you also determine how many faculty members you need. So that's the relationship there that I'm trying to explain. Does that make sense? Oh, okay.
Student affairs,
library.
Library,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah,
those-
yeah, yeah.
those areas
I
like
got
that.
you. Still should have goals there too. In one of my former lives, I was a dean of students, and we had to talk about we were going to reduce the number of student complaints that came in, or we were going to increase the time or decrease the time that it took to get transcripts out, or those are things that you can measure. That we're going to have 10% more compliments, or reduce the complaints by 40%, or whatever. Those are the kinds of goals that we see more often than not in the support areas. In the library, we're going to increase the traffic in the library between the hours of 7 and 9 by doing A, B, and C, where students typically don't come there because they're off watching TV or whatever. Those just some measurable goals, what it is that you're planning to do. We're going to decrease the number of books and increase the number of online publications that we get or whatever. Just something that we can see that you're attending to the needs of the students, that it fits your budget, and that it also is still, related to the mission of your institution. Yeah. One more, and then my time's up.
Okay. Oh, I have a question, Dr. Wheelan. It's about the new requirements potentially for boards in terms of them having to evaluate themselves. And do you see that as leading toward, or something that SAC-COC wants, say, boards to establish standards, minimum standards of how much the board members have to contribute, or what they have to do in order to maintain accreditation?
This is one of those times that we're not being prescriptive. We're not telling boards how to do it. We're just saying that when a team comes in, we want evidence that you have taken time to say, what are we doing? Have we done what we're supposed to do? Have we put the appropriate policies in place? Have we actually attended to the budget? Have we nurtured the president that we have? That's a legitimate goal. Remember, hire, evaluate. You got to have something to evaluate, though, and you can't always complain about what's going on if you don't give some guidance, along the way. Presidents should have a list of goals, and, are these the right goals? Did we help them achieve those goals? So that's the kind of thing that we're asking. Were they actively involved? Did they come to board meetings? I have a board of 77 people. And I can get all 77 of mine to 2 board meetings a year, so I don't understand why 20 people can't get to 1 4 times a year. I just don't. If you signed up to be on this board, then you need to be an active participant. Otherwise, you are taking up a seat, and we don't need you on this board. And boards need to have policies that talk about that. Okay? Thank you so much for including me in today, and I hope the rest of the meeting goes well.